The report I held in my hand stated that in 1940, the U.S. Army had discovered a 7-level subterranean facility, the size of a small city. This discovery came about when they began scouting in areas of New Mexico for potential sites to house the atomic development and testing program. It was by 1939 when FDR called up Briggs, a physicist who was the head of the Uranium Committee as a result of the Einstein-Silver letter. The letter strongly advised President Roosevelt to begin our own atomic development and research. The Nazis were already researching the destructive power of nuclear bombs, and they were far ahead of everyone else. Program as sensitive as atomic development had to be conducted under one roof and tightly controlled. FDR decided that the United States Army Corps of Engineers will take over all real estate acquisition, construction and maintenance for the project. This made sense because the Army Corps of Engineers had planes, soldiers and the necessary resources required. October 9, 1941, FDR gave the go-ahead for the development of the atomic weapon program. The Army Corps of Engineers, now in charge, chose a special unit of pilots and ground troops from Muroc Army Airfield out in California. Their job to finding a home for the atomic development efforts. The unit included geological experts, a surveyor, several trackers, cave experts, and even a few very good sharpshooters. The unit pilots were flying overhead to determining where the expedition team would go next. That was an ad hoc special forces unit. There everyone was hand-picked. The cave upper level, the first day. The uninhabited of the upper levels held many of what appeared to be ancient artifacts. The soldiers who were told to record everything they had found. Some walls were covered with screens that looked like a radar screen. Personnel stations, but not large enough for any human to fit in. Various sorts of cryptography machines, or what appeared to be electric typewriters. All of these were connected to the flat radar-like screens. The soldiers were not sure what it was or what it was used for. Everything was highly sophisticated and designed way beyond the latest military electronic equipment. There were thick black cables, with hundreds of individual lighted wires inside as fine as hair. The cables with lighted seems to be receiving transmitted signals of some kind, as there was a pattern to the blinking. Upon following the source of the cables showed that they came from deep beneath the upper levels. Nearly several hundred feet inside the upper level, they had found American Indian blades discernible from the leather. They found over 100 arrows, bows and quivers, few Colt revolvers and Winchester rifles. There was both unused and spent ammunition, indicating that something violent had occurred. They found human remains of American Indians easily identified by their traditional clothing as Apache warriors. What were Apache warriors doing here, and who are they fighting, and for what reason? The unit pulled back and set up camp at the end of the first day of exploring caverns inside. The next day they made their way deeper into the caverns and noticed that the natural formations on the walls began to give way to a more structured and uniform patterns of large flat walls. The walls were made of some metallic substance with a smooth black layer of what appeared to be highly polished. No one had ever seen such a material before. When they pressed their hands up against it, an illuminated print remained for some time. They began to find human-like remains with enlarged hands in very large eye sockets. They found more weapons, more dead bodies and blasts on the walls. More new small human-like remains were being found much deeper into the facility. The commanding officer in charge of the scouting expedition had enough awareness to call a personal friend him. At Muroc Base was a highly educated officer with a degree in archaeology, who possessed a very methodical scientific approach to every aspect of his work. Within 2 days, he was flown in, and with his help, he was able to catalogue and expertly remove everything with both precision and academic prudence. The commanding officer himself was well aware of what he had discovered. His decision to place an archaeology expert in charge of the site recovery operation proved to be an incredibly crucial decision, vital to later successes in technological advancement. In some rooms they found super-thin metallic sheets which they called the tablets. The tablets containing writing etched onto the surface with machine-like precision. The newly arrived office arrest team of scientific experts noted that the writing found on the tablets resembled cuneiform script from ancient Mesopotamia. Later, after some years of research by the U.S. Army and various academic experts, fully translate the language and confirm that it was a highly advanced cuneiform inscription. Within a few years' time, both academic and military linguistics teams would eventually develop the ability to fully translate the language, and the Army would fund the creation of a translation of the device. The Army goal was to attempt reverse engineering of all the equipment they found and to communicate with whoever was down there through the translation of the language. Now, with the ability to read their writings, the names of the subterranean inhabitants and other associated groups were discovered. There were 4 groups in the cave long time before, but only 2 groups left at the present time. The first group was the progenitors, aliens from the Sirius system. The second group was the Anunnaki aliens from the star Nibiru. The third group called Astra Albos, genetically modified aliens, and the fourth group was the Grey aliens, and if you will, there is a fifth group as the modern humans. The progenitors were a powerfully advanced group, often referred as the gods. The progenitors left Earth, but the reason for their decision is not known. Before leaving Earth, they created a genetically enhanced offspring to cope with Earth's hostile environment. They created the Grey. The tablets make no attempt to hide the fact that the Grey today have to some extent shared levels of incorporated alien animal and even alien insect DNA. The second incoming to Earth were the Anunnaki. Like the progenitors, they also created a servant caste, a workforce for gathering resources required for them to live comfortably life. They choose the indigenous primitive Earth population of early humans. For reasons unknown, the Anunnaki became afflicted by the weakening of their immune system. To continued survival, they created a new, better genetically enhanced successor group called the Astra Albos. Astra Albos was made to serve as a demigod for the Homo sapiens in order to control them while letting the Anunnaki avoiding direct confrontation. The DNA of the Astra Albos is here on Earth even today. They are the blood of secret cabal. These are the Rothschilds lineage, the Rockefellers lineage, the Windsor lineage, and many others families. Members of these families have been identified within the ranks of various shadow organizations and in secretive groups. They are today's the global elite, the powerful cabal. All of them must have a strict marriage based on familial lineage and breeding protocols. The lineage females can help them to sustain mental instability caused by environmental stresses and unwanted chemical influence. About 10,000 years ago, the humans revolt against the Astra Albos. The revolt started as a resulted from treachery and betrayal within the Astra Albos groups itself. At the end of the day, the expedition created a base camp inside the top level of the facility. They also set up at the surface level a camp directly above the Mesa Tunnel entrance. Level 2. Within days of setting up their camp, they began to explore further. The newly arrived scientific team would ask for as much material as could be extracted from the cave. They made their way deeper into the tunnels and down to the second lower level. At level 2, they had begun reporting sightings of people, so they thought they called them inhabitants. They could sense that someone or something was successfully tracking this soldier, but there was no effort to interact with them. The lower level tunnels smelled a bit like a factory that made industrial chemicals. Although the smell was bad, it was mostly obscured by the humidity which rendered their sinuses. There were incidents of the mysterious inhabitants from around the corners observe the soldiers. Usually from the great distance, almost like shadows, but there was never real interaction. Now it had been 3 weeks and the caverns and corridors and everyone was getting real comfortable. But as the discovery and collection of more artifacts continued, they found themselves traversing much deeper and deeper into what they now realized were the lower levels. And the walls continued to just get more sophisticated in design as they got lower. By the time they had cleared out the second level and began moving into the third, they began to encounter what seemed to be noises from unknown sources. First, it was a sound static or hissing noise that would last for several minutes at a time. As they got deeper into the third level, a nearly terrifying sound began to manifest and quickly disappear. The soldiers could then tell that it was collages of combined screams and cries from adults and children as if to warn their soldiers. One of the officers was able to conclude that what they were hearing was a recording being played repeatedly. 2 men had to be escorted out of the caves and back up to the surface because they could not handle the noise. But then just like that, it stopped. The stop coincided with the orders were given by the commanding officer to pack up and begin vacating. But 2 soldiers without permission from the commanding officer crawled down into the darkly lit tunnel area, where the sounds had been coming from. They traversed downward, made their way deeper in. They began to hear voices, a combination of whispers and clicking noises. While they continued on, the soldiers happened to see a group up to 50 inhabitants in a very large room. There were tables with what appeared to be lab equipment, and they seemed to be working, performing experiments or medical procedures on other inhabitants or animals. So much had been going on that it took a few minutes for the soldiers to even realize that what they were seeing were not humans but something else. On one side of this large room, there was a wall with screens like more of the electronic televisions, like they had seen in the higher levels, but with vivid colors and showing images of their base camp up on the first level. They were being monitored, everything that they had been doing since they arrived. But as they began to leave, trying not to be noticed, one of them dropped his pistol. He picked it back up, but that commotion alerted the entire room to their presence. As they began to quickly vacate, one of the soldiers was grabbed and dragged into their room screaming. The escaping soldier pulled out his pistol and began to run as fast as he could. He could hear pistol shots being fired repeatedly from the other soldier who was now back in that room. He must have been shooting at those things. As he ran, he heard inhabitant voices right behind him. They were coming after him and gaining ground. As he gained ground on the upper level, he began to scream out. The escaping soldier ran as fast as he could and screamed as high as he could. Then he began firing his weapon, hoping to kill whoever was chasing him. His shots finally alerted his group to his presence. The soldier, upon reaching the group, yelled his head off, screaming in utter terror, but now at last he was surrounded by fellow soldiers. The soldier continued to the commanding officer, telling him and explaining what was happening. "Look," he shouted. They all turned towards the direction that the soldier was looking, to see a wave of inhabitants with weapons headed in their direction. The battle. Everyone grabbed for their weapons and began taking cover behind the larger equipment. And some soldiers began to overturn wide metal tables located inside the cavernous area, where they had set up camp, positioning the tables as fast as they could to take cover. The commanding officer shouted, "No firing, no goddamn firing. Everybody just take cover and wait until I give an order." The commanding officer ordering his communications specialist to ask for help getting reinforcements down here ASAP. The inhabitants moved in a slow and disorganized formation. All of the inhabitants were quite small, but some appeared taller within their group. Their weapons began to light up with a green fluorescent colored glow, what would later be described as a chemoluminescence effect upon arming the weapon. The commanding officer immediately recognized an advantage, as the lighted from the weapons would serve as targets. He had ordered all lights in the camp to turned off. The unit had 2 snipers equipped with prototype night scopes that the army had been evaluating for purchase 1936 from Germany. With his 2 sharpshooters at hand using the night scopes coupled with the lighted weapons of the hostile inhabitants, the soldiers had some advantage. Once the inhabitants had reached to about 20 yards away from their camp perimeter and their weapons lighted up the room, the commanding officer shouted out the order fire. A couple of soldiers jumped forward and blasted their way to the front and countering the inhabitants. They managed to hit a few sprained bullets in all directions before getting hit with small glowing blasts blowing liquefied areas where they had been hit. It was noticed that the inhabitants would not move forward beyond a certain area which led directly into the perimeter. This behavior gave the men an advantage. One soldier who was diving behind a metal table decided to confront the inhabitants head-on. He killed several instantly and then went hand-to-hand with one of the larger inhabitants. As they fought, the soldier began to gain the upper hand and his fellows began to target that creature and hit him successfully several times. Other inhabitant grabbed the soldier and pulled him into a corner. After half a minute the soldier reappeared and began firing from behind the inhabitants. Somehow the soldiers knew how to use this damned weapon and he killed quite a few before making his way back to the group. The inhabitants and soldiers fought over a 3-hour before the war was finally ended. Many inhabitants were slaughtered with only a handful of soldiers being killed or injured. It was suspected that the inhabitants thought the soldiers would be similarly opponents with the same types of weapons and tactics as they encounter in other time period. But this group was a highly trained military unit with longer-range automatic weapons, comprised of men who were disciplined fighters. Many of the inhabitant weapons were recovered and the only living inhabitant was severely injured. So the men grabbed the dead and including a few more important-looking artifacts and especially the weapons from the dead inhabitants AMD left the area. Later when they reached the surface there was a feeling of relief and safe haven. Somehow they just knew that the inhabitants would not follow them to the surface. While returning to Muroc Air Base they began documenting their stories. Everything they found in the cave was collected and sent to New York. The army sealing up the entrance and the entire area as a classified military jurisdiction. The success of the campaign in 1940 contrasting the devastating failure of the 1979 event. The inhabitants had progressed as if planning so much so that they would fight with better success the next time. Epilogue. Later the army meet with local, Native American people to ask about events or stories where men had not returned from the cave area. The Native American have more to story to tell about UFOs and other group of aliens that have been on Earth long before them. A new team was created with 2 missions. The first was to establish communication with the inhabitants. The secondly one was to learn as much as they could the inhabitants' language and technology. The original commanding officer of the expedition and the science team, they all remained on the project. But everyone else was reassigned or honorably discharged under strict confidentiality. Those who make some problems sent to Portsmouth Naval Prison on charges of insubordination posing an immediate threat to national security. Sadly, they all never received credit for what they did or for what they discovered. They went off obscurely into history because many of them were either dead or reassigned to other classified positions. Some were discharged and many of them died with no official recognition.